Chapter 8. Ekim Bey. I wish to devote this chapter to my reminiscences of another man whom I consider remarkable, and whose manner of life in his later years, either by the will of fate or thanks to the laws operating in a self-developed individuality, was arranged down to the smallest detail like my own. At the present time, this man is in good health from the ordinary point of view, but according to my view, and speaking between ourselves, only his physical body is in good health. It is interesting to note that, contrary to the generally accepted opinion that people belonging to two different nationalities which have been engaged in centuries of racial struggle ought to feel towards each other instinctive hostility and even hate. And in spite of the difference of upbringing in family traditions and religious convictions, nevertheless, between Ekim Bey and myself, after our first meeting in early youth in quite unusual circumstances, there gradually arose a close friendship. And later, when all through all kinds of trivial incidents, our inner worlds had been drawn together like two arisings from the same source, our feeling for each other was like that of brothers. In this chapter, I shall describe my first chance meeting with Dr. Ekim Bey, who is respected by all serious persons that know him, as well as by the common run of people, who regard him as a great magician and wizard. I will also recount briefly several significant events which took place during our wanderings in the depths of Asia and Africa. At the present time, rewarded for his past merits by many decorations which have been proved to be not ephemeral, he somehow lives out his remaining years in a small and insignificant place in Egypt with the title of the Great Turkish Pasha. It must be said that he chose such a solitary spot as his dwelling place for his old age, in spite of having the means to live wherever he pleased, and to enjoy all the comforts of present-day life, chiefly because he wished to avoid the importunities of idle people and their curiosity, a property unworthy of man, which has become inherent in most of our contemporaries. The first time I met Ekim Bey was when he was still quite young. He was a student in a military school in Germany and had come, as he always did, to spend the summer with his father in Constantinople. We were of the same age. Before describing the circumstances in which I met him, I must say that, in the period before my first visit to Ekmezidem and my meeting with Pogassian, related in a previous chapter, when I was still being chased about everywhere like a harassed dog, seeking answers to the questions arising in my brain, which, according to the notions of most contemporary people, had become sick with psychopathy. I also happened to go to Constantinople, drawn by rumours of numerous marvels supposed to be performed by the dervishes there. On my arrival at Constantinople, I arranged to stay in the district called Pera and went from there to visit the monasteries of various dervish orders. Living at that time in the company of those dervish zealots, and of course not being occupied with anything practical, and thinking about nothing except all kinds of dervish nonsense, one gloomy day I clearly recognised, without any illusions, that very soon I would have absolutely no what is called dough. After realising this fact, I went about for a couple of days far from carefree, while all the times thoughts swarmed beneath my cranium, like the favourite flies of Spanish mules, about how to get hold of that contemptible something which for a contemporary man is almost the sole stimulus of his life. With these worries, I was standing one day on the large bridge between Pera and Stamboul. Leaning on the parapet, I began to ponder on the sense and significance of the continuous movement of the whirling dervishes, which at first glance seems automatic and without any participation of the consciousness. Under the bridge and near it, steamers were constantly passing and small boats plied unceasingly in every direction. On the Galata shore next to the bridge, there was a landing stage for the steamers crossing between Constantinople and the opposite shore of the Bosphorus. Near this landing stage, around the arriving and departing steamers, I saw boys swimming about and diving for coins thrown by people from the steamers. This interested me a great deal. I went nearer and looked on. Without any hurry, the boys very skillfully retrieved the coins thrown by the passengers in different places, without missing a single one. I watched for a long time, admiring the ease and dexterity of these boys, who were of various ages, from 8 to about 18. Suddenly the thought entered my head, why should not I also take up this profession? Am I any worse than these boys? And on the following day I went to the shore of the Golden Horn, to a place just below the Admiralty, to learn how to dive. While practising my diving, I even chanced to come across a teacher, a certain Greek, an expert, who used to go there to bathe. He taught me of his own accord some of the details of this great wisdom, and the rest I drew out of him by cunning. Then, already proper to me, over a cup of coffee, which we took after bathing, in a Greek cafe nearby. Of course, I will not go into details as to who paid for the coffee. At first it was very difficult. One had to dive down with open eyes, and the seawater irritated the membranes of my eyes, causing sharp pain, especially at night. But soon they grew accustomed to it, and I began to see as freely in the water as in the air. 2 weeks later, I began to earn a living around the steamers, with the local boys of all ages, by fishing for coins. Of course, I was not too successful at first, but very soon I never missed a single one. It must be said that when a coin is thrown into the water, it begins to sink very quickly, but the further from the surface, the more slowly it sinks, so if the water is very deep, it takes a long time before it finally reaches the bottom. In such a case, before diving, one has only to note well the place where the coin fell, and then it is not difficult to see it in the water and go after it. One day, a passenger, occupied with his thoughts, was leaning over the side of a ship watching the coin catchers, when he inadvertently let fall from his hands what is called a chaplet, an appurtenance indispensable for every serious Asiatic for those intervals when he is not fulfilling his life obligations. He immediately called to the diving boys to get the chaplet, but in spite of their attempts they could not find it, since, being far from the ship, they had not noticed where it fell. Evidently the chaplet was very valuable, as the passenger promised to pay the finder 25 Turkish pounds. After the steamer had left, all the coin catchers searched for a long time, but their efforts were useless. The water was deep, and as they expressed it, to grope all over the bottom was impossible. In general, it is very difficult to reach the bottom of deep water, just as water easily supports the living body on the surface, so it offers a strong resistance to its descent. Several days later, while I was diving for coins at that spot, a passenger happened to throw one so far away that, before I could swim up to where it had fallen, it had already sunk out of sight. As there had not been a good catch that day, I was determined at any cost to catch that coin. Just as I reached it, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like a chaplet. Swimming back to the surface, I remembered the chaplet for which 25 pounds had been offered. Having noted the spot, I dived down again without telling anyone, and when I realised that it was impossible to reach the bottom in the ordinary way, I brought with me the next day some heavy sledgehammers which I'd hired from a blacksmith, and tying them round my body, dived down with this weight. I soon found the chaplet, which turned out to be of amber, set with small diamonds and garnets. The same day I discovered that the passenger who had lost the chaplet was Pasha N, the former governor of a small district near Constantinople, and that he was then living on the opposite shore of the Bosphorus, not far from Scutari. As I had recently been not too well and was feeling worse each day, I decided not to dive for coins the next day, but to deliver the chaplet to its owner, and at the same time to visit the cemetery at Scutari. I went the following morning and soon found the Pasha's house. He happened to be at home, and when he was told that one of the coin catchers had come, who insisted on seeing him personally, he evidently understood at once what it was about and came out to me himself. When I handed him the chaplet, he was so sincerely overjoyed and so simple in his manner towards me that I was deeply moved and did not wish for anything in the world to accept the promised reward. He begged me at least to lunch at his house, and this I did not decline. After lunch I left immediately in order to catch the last but one returning steamer. But on the way to the steamer I felt so ill that I had to sit down on the steps of a house, where I lost consciousness. Passers-by noticed my condition, and, as I was not far from the Pasha's house, the news soon reached him that a boy had suddenly been taken ill. Hearing that the boy was the one who had brought him the chaplet, the Pasha himself came quickly with his servants and gave orders for me to be carried to his house and for a military physician to be called. Although I soon recovered consciousness, my condition was such that I could not move and was compelled to remain for the time being in the Pasha's house. That night all my skin began to crack and burn unbearably. Evidently being unaccustomed to long immersion in sea water, it could not tolerate the action of the salt. I was put in a wing of the house, and an old woman named Fatima Baji was appointed to take care of me. The Pasha's son, a student in a German military school, also came and helped the old woman look after me. This was Ekim Bey, who later became my bosom friend. While I was getting better, we conversed and chatted about all kinds of things, but gradually our talks began to take a philosophical turn, and when I'd recovered we parted as friends, and from then on kept up an uninterrupted correspondence. That year he left the military school in Germany to enter medical school, as his inner convictions had changed during this time and impelled him to give up his military career in order to become an army physician. 4 years passed. One day, in the Caucasus, I received a letter from him in which he wrote that he was already a physician and would like to see me, and at the same time to visit the Caucasus, which had interested him for a long time, and he asked when and where he could meet me. I was living that summer in the town of Suram, where I was at work making objects in plaster of Paris. I sent him a telegram that I was impatiently awaiting his arrival. A few days later he came. That year, Pogassian, Yelov and Karpenko, who had been a friend of my boyhood, had also come to Suram to spend the summer. Ekim Bey soon became intimate with these comrades of mine and felt like an old friend of theirs. We spent the entire summer in Suram, from where we frequently made short excursions, usually on foot. We climbed the Suram mountain pass and explored the environs of Bozan and Mikhalavov, in order to come in contact with the people in these places who had not yet been exposed to the effects of contemporary civilization. And once we even visited the famous Kurzovs, who have driven all the learned ethnographers mad. Ekim Bey, living several months in such conditions with us, young men of his own age, who were already thoroughly stuffed with all kinds of Don Quixotic aspirations, and taking part in all our exchanges of opinion, was willy-nilly drawn into our psychopathy, and like us, burned with eagerness to jump over his own knees. The four of us, Pogassian, Yelov, Karpenko and I, were at that time having many discussions about a proposal made to us a short time before by Prince Yuri Lubovsky to join him and his friends in a big expedition on foot, starting from the frontier town of Nakhavitchian and crossing Persia to the Persian Gulf. These discussions of ours, and all the perspectives opened up by this kind of travel, interested Ekim Bey so much that he asked us to put in a word with the prince for him to be allowed to join this expedition, and he began to think out how to obtain his father's permission and a year's leave of absence from his superiors. The upshot of it all was that, after making the necessary arrangements, partly by telegram and partly in person on his return home to prepare for this long journey, he began his first big expedition in our company on the day we set out from Nakhichevan, the 1st of January of the following year. We started at midnight from Nakhichevan, and by morning were already exposed to a demonstration of the wisdom of those biped inhabitants of our dear planet who are called frontier guards, and who are everywhere equally highly developed in the art of expressing their perspicacity and omniscience. There were 23 of us, including all those friends and comrades of mine to whom I've decided to devote separate chapters in this series of my writings. 3 of them, Pogassian, Yelov and Prince Lubovsky, I have already written about. With Dr. Ekim Bey, I will acquaint the reader in this chapter, and to the 2 others, Karpenko, the engineer, and the archaeology professor Skridlov, I will devote the subsequent chapters of this book. Our journey to the town of Tabriz, which we reached 10 days later, passed without any special incident. But not long after leaving Tabriz, an event occurred which I will describe in as much detail as possible, not merely because Ekim Bey took an active part, and manifested a deep interest in it, but also because it turned my own outlook on life completely upside down. While in Tabriz, we had heard a great deal about a certain Persian dervish, supposedly a performer of extraordinary miracles, and our interest was aroused. A little later in our journey, we again heard about him from a certain Armenian priest, and we then decided, although he lived in a place a good deal out of our way, to change the route we had planned in order to see him and find out for ourselves who and what he was. It was on the 13th day of a tiring journey, during which we spent the nights in the huts of Persian or Kurd shepherds or in small settlements, that we finally reached the village where this dervish lived. We were directed to his house, which was some distance beyond the village. We immediately made our way there and found him near his house in the shade of some trees, where he usually spoke with the people who came to him. We saw a man of fairly advanced age, dressed in rags, barefoot and seated cross-legged on the ground. Near him sat a number of young Persians who, as we discovered later, were his pupils. We approached, asking his benediction, and also seated ourselves on the ground, forming a half circle around him. Our conversation began. We put questions and he answered us, and in his turn he asked us questions. At first he received us rather coldly and showed little inclination to talk, but later, when he found that we had come a considerable distance, especially to talk with him, he became more cordial. He expressed himself very simply, in unpolished language, and at the beginning gave the impression, at least to me personally, of being an ignorant man, that is to say, uneducated in the European sense of the word. The conversation with the dervish was conducted in Persian, but in a particular dialect which none of our company knew except myself. Dr. Sari Ogli and one other who was not very fluent in it. Consequently, Sari Ogli and I asked the questions, immediately translating all that was said for the benefit of the others. It was dinner time. A pupil came bringing the dervish his food, rice in a bowl made out of a gourd. Continuing the conversation, the dervish began to eat. As we had eaten nothing since we had risen and started on our way early in the morning, we opened our knapsacks and began to eat also. I must remind you, at that time I was an ardent follower of the famous Indian yogis and carried out very exactly all the indications of what is called hatha yoga, and when eating I tried to masticate my food as thoroughly as possible. So, long after everyone, including the old man, had finished their simple meal, I continued slowly eating, trying not to swallow a single morsel without masticating it according to all the rules. Seeing this, the dervish asked me, "Tell me, young stranger, why are you eating like that?" I was so sincerely astonished by this question, which seemed to me very strange, and to say not very much from his knowledge, that I even had no desire to reply to him, and thought that we had made such a long detour in vain to meet a man who was not worth talking with seriously. Looking into his eyes, I felt not only pity but also ashamed for him, and replied with self-assurance that I chewed my food carefully so that it might be better assimilated in the intestines, and referring to the well-known fact that properly digested food gives the organism a large quantity of calories necessary for all our functions. I repeated all that I had extracted from various books on the subject. Shaking his head, the old man slowly and with conviction uttered the following saying, which is known throughout Persia: "Let God kill him who himself does not know, and yet presumes to show others the way to the doors of his kingdom." After that, Sari Olgi put a question to the dervish, which he answered briefly. He then turned again to me and asked, "Tell me, young stranger, you probably also do gymnastics." I was in fact working very hard at gymnastics at that time, and although I knew all the methods recommended by the Indian yogis, I kept to the system of the Swede Müller. I told the dervish that I did work at gymnastics and considered it necessary to practice twice a day, morning and evening, and I explained briefly the kind of exercises I was doing. "This is only for the development of arms, legs, and in general the external muscles," said the old man. But you have also inner muscles which are not affected at all by your mechanical movements. Yes, certainly, said I. Good. Let us now return to your way of chewing your food, the old man continued. If you chew in this way as a means to health or for the sake of other attainments, then I shall have to say, if you would like to know my sincere opinion, that you have chosen the worst possible way. By chewing your food so carefully, you reduce the work of your stomach. Now, you are young and everything is all right, but you are accustoming your stomach to do nothing, and when you are older, owing to the lack of normal work, your muscles will be to a certain extent atrophied, and that is bound to occur if you continue this system of chewing. You know that our muscles and body get weaker in old age. Now, in addition to the natural weaknesses of old age, you will have another brought on by yourself, because you are accustoming your stomach not to work. Can you imagine how it will be then? On the contrary, it is not at all necessary to masticate carefully. At your age, it is better not to chew at all, but to swallow whole pieces, even bones if possible, to give work to your stomach. I can see that those who have advised you to practice this mastication, and also those who write books about it, have, as is said, heard a bell without knowing where the sound came from. These simple, obvious and consistent words of the old man made me completely change my first opinion of him. Until then I had put questions to him out of curiosity, but from that moment I felt a serious interest in him and began to listen with the greatest attention to everything he said. Suddenly I understood with the whole of my being that ideas I had hitherto accepted as indisputable truths were incorrect. I realised that up till then I had seen things only from one side. Now many things appeared in quite a new light. Hundreds of new questions arose in my mind concerning this subject. Carried away by our conversation with the dervish, the doctor and I quite forgot about the rest of our comrades and stopped translating what was said. Seeing how deeply we were interested, they kept interrupting us with the questions. What did he say? What is he talking about? And each time we had to put them off, promising to tell them everything in detail later. When the dervish had finished speaking about artificial mastication and the different means of assimilating food and its automatic transformation in us according to law, I said, "Be so kind, Father, and also explain to me what you think of what is called artificial breathing. Believing it useful, I practice it according to the instructions of the yogis, namely, after breathing in the air, I hold it a certain time and then slowly exhale it. Perhaps this also should not be done." The dervish, seeing that my attitude towards his words had completely changed, began to be more in sympathy with me and explained the following. If you harm yourself with your way of chewing food, you harm yourself 1,000 times more by the practice of this breathing. All the exercises in breathing which are given in books and taught in contemporary esoteric schools can do nothing but harm. Breathing, as every sane, thinking man should understand, is also a process of feeding, but on another sort of food. Air, just like our ordinary food, entering the body and being digested there, disintegrates into its component parts, which form new combinations with each other as well as with the corresponding elements of certain substances which are already present. In this way, those indispensable new substances are produced which are continuously being consumed in the various unceasing life processes in the organism of man. You must know that, to obtain any definite new substance, its constituent parts must be combined in exact quantitative proportions. Let us take the most simple example. You have to bake bread. For this you must first of all prepare the dough. But to make dough, you must take definite proportions of flour and water. If there is too little water, you will get, instead of dough, something that will crumble at the first touch. If you take too much water, you will simply get a mash, such as is used for feeding cattle. It is the same in either case. You will not get the dough necessary for baking bread. The same thing occurs in the formation of every substance necessary for the organism. The parts composing those substances must be combined in strict proportions, both qualitatively and quantitatively. When you breathe in the ordinary way, you breathe mechanically. The organism, without you, takes from the air the quantity of substances that it needs. The lungs are so constructed that they are accustomed to work with a definite amount of air. But if you increase the amount of air, the composition of what passes through the lungs is changed, and the further inner processes of mixing and balancing must also inevitably be changed. Without the knowledge of the fundamental laws of breathing in all particulars, the practice of artificial breathing must inevitably lead very slowly, but nonetheless surely, to self-destruction. You should bear in mind that besides substances necessary for the organism, the air contains others which are unnecessary and even harmful. Well then, artificial breathing, that is to say, a forced modification of natural breathing, facilitates the penetration into the organism of these numerous substances in the air which are harmful to life, and at the same time upsets the quantitative and qualitative balance of the useful substances. Artificial breathing also disturbs the proportion between the amount of food obtained from the air and the amount obtained from all our other foods. Hence, on increasing or diminishing the intake of air, you must correspondingly increase or diminish the amount of other kinds of food, and to maintain the correct proportion, you must have a full understanding of your organism. But do you know yourself so well? Do you know, for example, that the stomach needs food not only for nourishment, but also because it is accustomed to taking in a certain quantity of food? We eat chiefly to gratify our taste and to obtain the accustomed sensation of pressure which the stomach experiences when it contains this particular quantity of food. In the walls of the stomach there branch out what are called wandering nerves which, beginning to function when there is not a certain pressure, give rise to the sensation we call hunger. Thus we have different hungers, a so-called bodily or physical hunger and, if it may be so expressed, a nervous or psychic hunger. All our organs work mechanically, and in each, owing to its nature and habits, there is created a special tempo of functioning, and the tempos of the functioning of different organs are in a definite relation to each other. So there is established in the organism a certain equilibrium, one organ depending on another, all are connected. By artificially changing our breathing, we change first of all the tempo of the functioning of our lungs, and as the activity of the lungs is connected, among other things, with the activity of the stomach, the tempo of the functioning of the stomach is also changed, at first slightly, then more and more. For the digestion of food, the stomach needs a certain time. Let us say that food must remain there an hour. But if the tempo of the stomach's functioning is changed, then the time for the passing of food for the stomach is also changed. The food may pass through so quickly that the stomach has only time to do a part of what it has to do. It is the same with the other organs. That is why it is 1,000 times better to do nothing with our organism. Better leave it damaged than try to repair it without knowing how. I repeat, our organism is a very complicated apparatus. It has many organs with processes of different tempos and with different needs. You must either change everything or nothing. Otherwise, instead of good, you might do harm. Numerous illnesses arise just from this artificial breathing. In many cases, it leads to enlargement of the heart, constriction of the windpipe, or damage to the stomach, liver, kidneys, or nerves. It very rarely happens that anyone who practices artificial breathing does not harm himself irreparably, and this rare case occurs only if he stops in time. Whoever does it for a long time invariably has deplorable results. If you know every small screw, every little pin of your machine, only then can you know what you must do. But if you just know a little and experiment, you risk a great deal because the machine is very complicated. There are many tiny screws which might easily be broken by a strong shock and which cannot afterwards be bought in any shop. Therefore, since you have asked me for it, my advice to you is stop your breathing exercises. Our conversation with the dervish continued for quite a long time. Before we left, I had managed to talk over with the prince what we should do next, and so, after thanking the dervish, I told him that we proposed staying another day or two in the neighbourhood, and asked whether he would allow us to converse with him once more. He consented, and even said that if we wished we could come to see him the following evening after dinner. We stayed not 2 days, as we intended, but a whole week, and every evening we all went to this dervish and conversed with him, and afterwards, until late each night, Sari Olgi and I repeated to our comrades everything that had been said. The last time we went to the dervish to thank him and take our leave, Ekim Bey, to our great surprise, suddenly turned to him and, in a humble voice unusual for him, said in Persian, "Good father, during these days I have become convinced with the whole of my being that you—" Interrupting himself at this point, he hurriedly asked Sari Olgi and me not to hinder him from speaking for himself, and to correct him only when the expressions he used had a special meaning in the local dialect which might change the sense of what he was saying. Then he continued, "That you are the very man I have instinctively been searching for, a man to whom I could wholly entrust the guidance of my inner world, in order to regulate and neutralise the struggle which has recently arisen in me between two totally opposing strivings. On the other hand, numerous life circumstances over which I have no control do not permit me to live here, somewhere near you, so that whenever necessary I could come and reverently hear your directions and counsels as to how I should live, in order to put an end to this tormenting inner struggle and to prepare myself to acquire the being worthy of man. That is why I beg you, if it is possible, not to refuse to give me now a brief few indications and guiding principles of life appropriate to a man of my age." To this unexpected and high-sounding request of Ekim Bey, this venerable man, the Persian dervish, replied with precision and in great detail. I will not record here in this second series of my writings what he then explained, considering it premature for serious readers, and as regards the correct sequential perception of all my writings, even harmful to the aim of genuine understanding, I have therefore decided, with a clear conscience, to expound the quintessence of these explanations only later, in a corresponding chapter of the third series of my writings, entitled The Physical Body of Man, Its Needs According to Law, and Possibilities of Manifestation. Early in the morning, following this last visit to the dervish, we resumed our journey. Instead of going, as previously mapped out, in the direction of the Persian Gulf, we went west towards Baghdad, since 2 of our company, Karpenko and Prince Nijerzi, had fallen sick with fever and were becoming worse from day to day. We reached Baghdad, and after staying there about a month, we separated and went off in different directions. Prince Lubavsky, Yelov and Ekim Bey left for Constantinople. Karpenko, Nijerzi and Pogassian decided to follow the Euphrates upstream as far as its source, then to go over the mountains and cross the Russian border. But Dr. Sari Olgi and I, with the others, agreed to turn back and go in the direction of Khorasan, and only when there to decide on the final stage of our journey. In setting down my memories of Dr. Ekim Bey, I must not fail to mention his ardent interest in hypnotism and everything relating to it. He was particularly interested in those phenomena which in their totality are called the power of human thought, and the study of which is a distinct branch of the contemporary science of hypnotism. And indeed he obtained, especially in the said branch, unprecedented practical results. Thanks chiefly to the experiments he performed on people in order to elucidate from every aspect the various manifestations of the power of human thought, he was reputed by those around him to be a redoubtable magician and wizard. The experiments which he performed on his friends and acquaintances with the mentioned aim led, among other things, to the result that some of the people who had met or even only heard about him began to be afraid of him, while others, on the contrary, became exaggeratingly respectful and even, as he said, began to lick his boots. I think that the main cause of this false conception which people formed of him was not his deep knowledge and the extraordinary development of inner forces he had achieved, but simply his understanding of one property of the functioning of man's organism, which might be connected to a certain degree with the civility of human nature. This property, which is inherent in every ordinary man, to whichever class he may belong and whatever his age, is that whenever he thinks about something concrete outside himself, then his muscles instantly strain, that is to say, vibrate in the direction taken by his thoughts. For example, if he thinks about America and his thoughts are turned in the direction where, according to his notions, America lies, certain of his muscles, particularly, so to say, the fine ones, vibrate towards the same place. In other words, their entire attention strains in that direction. In the same way, if the thoughts of a man are turned upwards towards the second floor of a house when he himself is on the first floor, certain of his muscles are strained and, as it were, raised upwards. In short, a movement of the thoughts in a definite direction is always accompanied by a tension of the muscles in the same direction. This phenomenon proceeds even among those who are aware of its existence and who try by all the means known to them to avoid it. Everyone has probably happened to see, in some theatre or circus or other public place, how various so-called Indian fakirs, conjurers, wonder workers, and other remarkable exponents of the secrets of supernatural knowledge astonish people with their magical phenomena, finding hidden objects, or performing some other action previously decided upon by the audience. In accomplishing these miraculous feats, these magicians hold the hand of one of the spectators, who of course is thinking about the action decided on, and simply by means of the unconscious indications or shocks received from the person's hand, they guess the action and carry it out. They can do this not because they possess some special knowledge, but merely because they know the secret of this property of man. Knowing this secret, anyone could do the same with a little practice. One has only to be able to concentrate one's attention on the other person's hand and catch its slight, almost imperceptible movements. With practice and perseverance, one can always succeed, like a magician, in guessing what has been thought of. For instance, if the idea is that the magician should pick up a hat lying on the table, then, even if the person knows the trick and tries hard to think about the shoes lying under the couch, he will still unconsciously be thinking about the hat, and the muscles which guide the magician will tense in that direction, as they are subject more to the subconscious than to the consciousness. As I have said, Ekim Bey performed experiments of this sort on his friends in order to learn more about the human psyche and thus determine the cause of hypnotic influences. Among the experiments he made to accomplish this task, he had set himself was a highly original one which astounded the uninitiated more than any of the fakir's tricks. He proceeded as follows. On a sheet of paper divided into squares, he wrote the entire alphabet in order, and on the bottom line all the numbers from 1 to 9 followed by 0. He prepared several such sheets, and on each sheet he wrote the alphabet of a different language. Sitting at a table, he put one of the alphabet sheets in front of him, a little to the left, and with his right hand he took a pencil. On his left, just opposite the alphabet, he seated the subject of the experiment, for example, somebody who had asked him to tell his fortune. Then, with his left hand, Ekim Bey took the right hand of this person and began to speak more or less as follows. First of all, I must know your name. And then, as if talking to himself, he continued slowly, the first letter of your name, and he placed on the alphabet the hand of the person wishing to know his fate. Thanks to the mentioned human property, when the hand passed over the letter with which the name began, it gave an involuntary start. Ekim Bey, knowing the significance of this movement, perceived it and continued, the first letter of your name is, and he pronounced the letter over which the hand had trembled and wrote it down. Continuing in this way, he found out the next few letters of the name, and having done so, guessed the whole name. For example, having obtained the letters S, T and E, he could tell that the name was Stephen. Then he said, your name is Stephen. Now I must find out how old you are. And he began to move the hand over the numbers. He then discovered whether the man was married or not, how many children there were, the name of each child, the name of his wife, the name of his greatest enemy, greatest friend, and so on and so forth. After several of these miraculous guesses, his clients were so astonished that they forgot everything on earth and proceeded to tell Ekim Bey all he wanted to know, and letting go of their hand, he had only to repeat what they themselves had said. Then, whatever fantastic stuff he might tell them about their future, they believed it all, and hung with awe on every word. Later, everyone on whom Ekim Bey had made this experiment went around talking about it on all possible occasions and, of course, made such extravagant additions about his powers that the listeners' hairs stood on end. And so, among those who knew and heard about him, an image was built up which gradually acquired the aura of a magician, and even his name was uttered in a whisper and with trepidation. Many people, not only Turks but also people from other countries, chiefly from Europe, began to write to him and pester him with all kinds of requests. Some begged him to foretell their future from their handwriting, others to remedy their unrequited love, yet others to cure them from a distance of their chronic ailments. He received letters from pashas, generals, officers, mullahs, teachers, priests, merchants, and from women of every age, but especially from young women of all nationalities. In short, there were such heaps of these letters with different kinds of requests that, if Ekim Bey had wished to send even empty replies to each of the writers, he would have had to have no less than 50 secretaries. One day, when I visited him in Scutari at his father's estate on the shores of the Bosphorus, he showed me many of these letters, and I remember how we almost split our sides with laughter at the naivety and stupidity of people. He ultimately grew so weary of it all that he even gave up his well-loved work as a physician and left the places where he was known. Ekim Bey's thorough knowledge of hypnotism and of all the automatic properties of the psyche of the ordinary man turned out to be very useful during one of our journeys, when he succeeded in getting us out of a very difficult situation into which we had fallen. Once, when Ekim Bey and I, with several of our comrades, was in the town of Yangishar in Kashgar, having one of our usual long rests, intending to go next into the valleys of the Hindu Kush mountains, Ekim Bey received news from his uncle in Turkey that his father was failing rapidly and would probably not live long. This news disturbed Ekim Bey so much that he decided to interrupt his journey and return to Turkey as quickly as possible in order to spend what little time remained with his beloved father. As these incessant wanderings from place to place under constant nervous strain had begun to weary me, and as I also wished to go and see my parents, I decided to break off my journey and travel as far as Russia with Ekim Bey. Taking leave of our comrades, we went through Turkestan towards Russia. After many adventures and a host of great difficulties, without following the usual roads from Kashgar, all of which went to Osh, we managed to reach the town of Angian in the Fergana region. We had decided to go through this once great region because we wished to take advantage of the opportunity to inspect the ruins of several ancient towns, about which we heard a great deal and which we expected to find chiefly by means of logical deductions from certain historical data. We had thus greatly lengthened our journey before we came out on the main road near Ajijan. In Margalan, we bought our railway tickets to Krasnovodsk and were already seated in the train when we found, to our great distress, that we had not enough money for the rest of our trip, nor even for the next day's food. Moreover, during our travels through Kashgar, our clothes had become so shabby that we were not fit to be seen in public, so money was also needed for buying clothes. We therefore decided not to go as far as Krasnodar, but to change trains at Chernihiv and go to Tashkent, a large centre where we could send for money by telegraph and manage to live as best we could until it arrived. We did so. Having arrived at Tashkent and taken a room in a cheap hotel not far from the station, we first of all went to send off the telegrams, and then, as this took almost all the money we had left, we went to the bazaar to sell our remaining possessions: rifles, watches, pedometer, compass, maps, in short, everything on which we could hope to raise any money at all. In the evening, while we were walking along the street and pondering on our situation, and wondering where the people to whom we had telegraphed might be, and whether they would have the sense to remit the money immediately, without noticing it, we reached old Tashkent. We sat down in a chikana, continuing to ponder on what we would do if the money were delayed, and after long deliberation, and examination of the various possibilities, we finally decided that, there in Tashkent, Ekim Bey should give himself out to be an Indian fakir, and I a sword swallower and a man who could consume any quantity of poisonous substances. And we made all kinds of jokes about it. The next morning, the first thing we did was to go to the offices of a Tashkent newspaper, to the department which accepted advertisements and also took orders for all sorts of posters. The clerk there was a very friendly Jew who had recently arrived from Russia. After chatting with him a little, we arranged for advertisements to be inserted in all 3 of the Tashkent newspapers, and also ordered large posters announcing that a certain Indian fakir had arrived. I do not at the moment remember what Ekim Bey called himself, but I think it was Ganez or Ganzin, and that with his assistant Salakan, on the following evening in the hall of a certain club, he would give a demonstration of hypnotic experiments and many other supernatural phenomena. The clerk also undertook to obtain the permission of the police for putting up the posters throughout the town, and by the next day, posters about unprecedented miracles were already eyesores to the inhabitants of both new and old Tashkent. By that time, we had found 2 unemployed men who had come from the interior of Russia, and after sending them to the baths for a good scrub, we took them to our hotel and prepared them for hypnotic seances. We finally brought them into such a state of hypnosis that one could stick a large pin into their chests, sew up their mouths, and, placing them between 2 chairs with the head on one and the feet on another, put enormous weights on their stomachs, after which anyone in the audience who wished could come and pull a hair out of their heads, and so on and so forth. But what particularly astonished all the learned doctors, lawyers and others was when Ekim Bey, by the means I've described, found out their names or their ages. In short, at the end of the first séance, besides a full cash box, we received hundreds of invitations to dinner and had the women of all classes of society made eyes at us. Of this there is no need to speak. On 3 evenings in succession we gave séances, and as we had earned more money than we needed, we left without delay to escape from our burdensome admirers. In writing this chapter, which has revived in my memory our various expeditions and wanderings through Asia, I have recalled by association the curious notion about this continent which is held by most Europeans. Having lived 15 years uninterruptedly in the West, and being constantly in contact with people of all nationalities, I have come to the conclusion that no one in Europe knows or has any idea about Asia. Most people in Europe and America have the notion that Asia is a kind of indefinite, great continent adjoining Europe and inhabited by savage or, at best, semi-savage groups of peoples who just happen to be there and go wild. Their ideas about its size are very vague. They are always ready to compare it with the European countries and do not suspect that Asia is such a vast continent that several Europes could be put into it, and that it contains whole races of people about whom not only Europeans, but even Asiatics themselves have never heard. Furthermore, among these savage groups, certain sciences, as for example medicine, astrology, natural science and so on, without any wiseacring or hypothetical explanations, have long since attained a great degree of perfection which a European civilization may perhaps reach only after several hundred years.